What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. So I just want to remind you guys about tomorrow is the End the Damn Wars national protest. So you can watch the stream that I did with Magnus and Andrew Zigman for more information on that. We had a stream on Wednesday, and I will be live on the ground covering that tomorrow at noon in Washington, D.C. But today, we are going to discuss the role of the U.S. and the West, the role that they play in creating war in the African region, and what are some of the solutions that we can do as working class people. So joining me to discuss this is a young activist who I saw interviewed on Black Power Media. Her name is Yolian Ogbu. She is a recently graduated political science student from the University of North Texas. She was also the student government president for that university. And currently, she is an organizing member of Horn of Africa, Pan-Africans for Liberation Solidarity, or HOA PALS. So Yolian, thank you very much for being on this show. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So let's start by talking about Pan-Africanism. So what is this, and how did you become a part of HOA PALS?
So, Pan-Africanism, in the way that, in the framework that I have learned it and studied it, is that it needs to be seen as a political objective. It is quite
Mm-hmm.
literally the total liberation and political unification of the entire African continent, of African peoples, under scientific socialism. So, the way I would describe it is that it's a revolutionary response to everything that has happened historically, the dispossession, exploitation, damn near genocide of all African people everywhere. And we um, definitely believe that, until Africa is free, no one's going to be free. So that's kind of a little bit about what that is. And then how I became a part of HOA PALS was we had, along with several other members from all over the states, we even have folks from out of the country, kind of come together and realize that there wasn't a space for folks to do organizing work, to do political education, specifically centered around the Horn of Africa and the specific issues that happen there, and the, remedying the ahistorical nature of like storytelling that happens in that specific region. So recognize the importance for us to be able to focus on that. And as someone who is from Eritrea, I've also recognized that like many countries in that region take a back seat to having, very, I think, specific and important conversations on how colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, all of these systems have kind of intertwined to inevitably create the mess that we see today. So we had, along with several other people, kind of come together to create that group. And since then, we've grown tremendously.
Awesome. Yeah, I love to see, movements like that growing. So what are some solutions that HOA pals are trying to accomplish, and how do you all plan on achieving them?
So the reason why we even came together and created this group, right, was because we recognized that there was a gap in understanding of what was happening in that region, right? But we recognized that, at least from the standpoint that I am in the diaspora, I'm a member, I'm living in the States, I recognize that I have been brought up through an education that does not center revolutionaries, that does not center and have the purpose of liberation for all African people, for oppressed people across the world. And so because of that, I definitely grew up with this type of propaganda that has not allowed me to recognize why I'm being politicized and the oppression and exploitation of my people. Because of that, we have recognized that so many people like me are out there in the States, across the world, taking in this propaganda, and we have this liberal ideology that we're not able to have, and concrete class analysis, any type of political analysis on what's happening in the region. So inevitably, what we end up doing is kind of help the West be able to kind of regurgitate the same propaganda to our own people, and then that kind of creates that cycle of being a part of this like neo-colonial class of people that continue to want to subjugate Africa and Africans. So because of that, we have worked together to recognize that political education is key. When we created this organization, we had started to put together readings and specific work study groups so that we can be able to continue to ramp up and unlearn liberal ideology. That was our first step for any person that were to come into our group, is recognize that we are unlearning everything before we continue to learn what really happened, the real truth, real history, etc. So that is kind of first and foremost. And then the second thing is working on specifically getting away from neo-colonial borders. And what I mean by that is a lot of what's happening right now in the Horn is actually all around colonialism and imperialism and the effects of that in regards to Ethiopia, in regards to Somalia, and so many other countries. And if we continue to go with the mindset that we don't see ourselves as members of the region, but as just as members of our particular country, that is a way to divide us, right? Because we have to recognize that all these borders were fake, they were colonial. So what we are attempting to do is in real time participate in this unification of Africans in the region by discussing issues and recognizing historical connections of organizing, movement building across these borders. So we don't, that's why we created this group as more of a region rather than country to country, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Joe Biden has not ended fascism, right? Like a lot of the left were saying he was going to do if we voted for him. And he is continuing it. He's picking up where Trump left off and bombing countries with black and brown people, like in Syria, Somalia, and Afghanistan. So I want to discuss Somalia with you. And Biden bombed Somalia as soon as he took office and then bombed them again in July. And people need to understand that the US is bombing that country after it created the problem and the terrorists in that country. And we need to understand the history of that country and our involvement. Our communications and education system, just like how you said, they indoctrinate us and they purposely make us illiterate on foreign policy. So I want to show this article here, and I wanted to read a part of it. This is from TJ Coles, and this was published on The Gray Zone. He also made an appearance on Facts on the Ground, which is another channel, a part of the MCSC network. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, on the role that AFRICOM played in, in what the U.S. did in helping to create the Al-Shabaab, and then what it leads to, the chaos in that country. So what is said here, AFRICOM recently bragged about how it helped coordinate with Somali partners, meaning elements of the regime imposed on the country by the West, to organize the Biden-led bombing of Al-Shabaab. AFRICOM says the command's initial assessment is that no civilians were injured or killed, given the remote nature of where this engagement occurred. But who knows? U.S. commanders operating in the African theater have tended to dismiss the notion that civilian deaths should be tallied at all. In 1995, for example, the U.S. wound down its assistance to the UN mission in Somalia, but ended up in a shooting war in which several Somalis died. The U.S. commander, Lieutenant General Anthony Zinni, said at the time, "I'm not counting bodies. I'm not interested." So that's a pretty disgusting statement there by the general, but it's not surprising. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, and what more can you tell us about AFRICOM and the excuse the Pentagon is using about how they are going after the Al-Shabaab, what they're calling terrorists.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's actually so much here. I think the first thing I wanted to say that off right, AFRICOM is one of the worst things to have ever happened to the continent, at least recently. Coups in the region, and this has been documented since AFRICOM has been established, has literally exponentially accelerated. I think if I can remember correctly, it was more than like 13 coups that have happened since 2013, I believe. It is literally creating an emboldened military class in Africa, right? They're using fellow Africans and creating that class in order to be loyal to US and European interests. So what's happening is we're noticing this cycle of folks that say that they recognize, for example, that the U.S. is, oh yeah, they're infamous for training right-wing guerrilla forces in Latin America, for example. I think that has been something that has been talked about for a while, but I feel like what's less known, well known, is what you brought up. You know, the Pentagon's military training programs in Africa, what that has done for Africans, and literally experienced however many military coups again and again. Mali is a good example. What's happening in Guinea right now is actually a great example. And so when people say that we're off to save Africans through AFRICOM by going in there and defeating these so-called terrorists, it's really difficult for me to listen to that kind of rhetoric and think, wow, the U.S., supposedly the purveyor of all human rights and world peace, is trying to tell me that they're going to go save Africans, people that they don't know, and try to save them from so-called terrorists. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. What I would say, Africa's biggest terrorist threat, right, is not, you know, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, all of these other terrorist groups, because terrorism resulting from the capitalist, imperialist occupations, those were the neo-colonial projects that outstrips any other terrorism that's different on the planet. It does, because these neo-colonial projects have been killing Africans since day one. I mean, if you think about it, the amount of African lives that have been lost as a result of this imperialist colonial project that we live in today are immense. We have Belgium alone that accounts for over 14 million people in the Congo that have died. Germany's genocide of the Herero and Nama people were around 100,000 or more. So when people talk about and prioritize internal threats in Africa, I would go as far as to question, are those people maintaining the fact that the foreign policy and neo-colonial control that America and the rest of the West have over Africa shouldn't be prioritized? That isn't for all of the internal threats happening on the continent today. I mean, you just pointed out, we're going into countries saying that we're going to save these folks from terrorism, from the very same terrorism that we created. I don't understand what more they could do to potentially help. So I think that that's one of the main things I wanted to bring up. And off rip, we know NATO and all of their neo-colonial allies are not the protectors of anyone. If anything, they destroy everything. So I think these imperialist institutions need to continue to be prioritized as things that we must analyze and recognize that they are dominant in destroying all forms of democratic processes, all forms of liberation, etc. So yeah, that's a little bit about AFRICOM. It's terrible.
Yeah. And now, you know, the U.S. is making Africa the new battleground for the war on terror. I mean, at this point, we should know that the real reason that the U.S. wants to be in that country is for the minerals, the rare earth minerals that are in that region, and now they're trying to obtain it for these billionaires for the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum. And the predator class wants to use these rare earth minerals to advance their agenda. Like, what are they going to use it for? They're going to use the environmental reasons as an excuse for why do we need to get these resources, like cobalt from the Congo. And then some of those resources are needed to make some of these technologies that they want to use, you know, for the Internet of Things and for surveillance. But I wanted to show this video here of Western countries. They're using ISIL as an excuse to send more troops to Africa. And I'm gonna share this clip, and then I want to get your thoughts on it.
Conference in Rome, members of the Global Coalition Against ISIL warn the fight is not over. Africa is the new battleground.
Ho proposto di istituire un gruppo di lavoro dedicato all'Africa.
I proposed the creation of a working group to identify and halt the terrorist threat of Islamic State in the African continent. We welcome some African countries that are not members of the coalition, such as Burkina Faso, Ghana and Mozambique, invited as observers.
The armed group is gaining ground in the Sahel and in Mozambique's northern province of Cabo Delgado. Nearly 1 million people have been displaced and 3,000 killed as a result of the fighting that began in 2017 between an ISIL affiliate and Mozambique's security forces. Last week, the 16-member Southern African Development Community announced the deployment of troops to support Mozambique's military in its fight against ISIL.
Our approach rests on the basis that terrorism is a global threat, and if we want to defeat it, we must further our understanding, with the prospect of eradicating it from our entire region. I would like to assure you that in Mozambique, we are deeply aware of our responsibilities.
In the Sahel regions of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, ISIL-affiliated groups are increasing their attacks. That's despite the presence of 14,000 UN troops, the G5 regional coalition, and the support of 5,000 French soldiers.
The Islamic State's own central leadership, they see their main prospects for the success of their brand as being in Africa. And it's interesting that even as this summit is taking place right now in Rome, only some days ago, the Islamic State's official spokesman released a speech in which he talked about Islamic State affiliates in various parts of the world, and he singled out for praise, in particular, the affiliates of the group in both West and Central Africa.
Fearing a wave of people illegally traveling to Europe, some European countries are joining France by sending troops on the ground to not only fight ISIL, but to disrupt human trafficking and illegal migration routes. For the coalition against ISIL, Africa is now the front line against the armed group. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera.
So I first saw that clip when Nico House reported on it, that Al Jazeera clip, and he pointed this out. How are they going to declare Africa as the battleground for the war on terror without consulting the African continent, right?
Right. I mean, this is not new. There's never been any type of consultation when, originally the Europeans came over to colonize the entire continent. They didn't think to ask what the people on the continent would want. So I'm not surprised. I think the violence we see now, what is happening and what has been happening in so-called Middle East, it's moving to Africa now. I mean, they've done the damage in that region, and they're only wanting to continue to move forward and find another place to declare as a battleground. I mean, with the same rhetoric they used 20 years ago at around this time, after 9/11 and all of that other stuff. So that's, again, I'm not surprised. I think, if anything, it's really disgusting to hear how countries that came to colonize the continent and just almost completely destroyed it in order to search and capitalize on the resource-rich landmass within the continent. The same people that did that are now attempting to come here and saying that they're trying to save Africans from human trafficking and other atrocious things that are happening to people on the continent, etc. It's the same type of propaganda, same cycle of rhetoric that happens every day. It's interesting that you bring up the fact that there was no consultation by Africans at all. I mean, even then, right, in our current political paradigm, we notice that the masses of African people aren't even represented by their neo-colonial governments, which I find that funny. So either way, even if they did consult the neo-colonial governments, they probably would have gotten some level of support. So I'm not surprised. It's another form of violence. Yeah, it really is. It really is.
So, I mean, what the U.S. and the UK did in Somalia, I mean, that's just another example of what colonizer countries have done all throughout history. And look at what Belgium, the Belgian colonizers did in the Congo in the early 1900s, and how they turned that into a slave state for rubber and ivory. Right. I mean, what Belgium and Leopold did is something that should be talked about in public history classes. I mean, there were 10 million people who were massacred and tortured during that ruling for what? For minerals. And I mean, they would cut off the fingers and the limbs of Africans who wouldn't find enough minerals as punishment. And then in the 1950s, the U.S. intelligence agency had Mobutu Sese Seko as an asset, where he served as an army officer for the Congo. Now, this isn't a region that's talked about enough in independent media. This is a region in which the U.S. oligarchs are interested in retrieving cobalt, and they're doing this for the big green billionaires for electric car batteries. Lithium's another mineral that they're trying to retrieve from countries in the global south. So what are your thoughts about Congo, and what can you tell us about its history of being a victim of Western imperialism?
Yeah, the people of Congo have been suffering since God knows how long, and it hasn't even decreased at all. I mean, when I think about the Congo, I recognize that there would be no laptops, no cell phones, no drones, no satellites, almost nothing, right, without the resource extraction from the Congo. There'd literally be no rubber, no aluminum, no steel, no diamonds. None of these things that allowed for folks like Elon Musk to get super rich and end up creating Tesla today. Like, none of that would exist without the mining and the exploitation of people in Congo until today. And I think that even as working class people in the States, that has to be recognized as well. And that's why it's really important for us to have the anti-imperialism as part of the analysis when we do discuss class, when we do discuss issues in the States. But in terms of the Congo, I mean, again, everyone talks about things such as the Holocaust and other forms of genocide. That's probably one of the most well-known, right? But no one wants to talk about what those Europeans had also done to Africans continue to do the same level of violence today. I mean, genocide has not stopped on the continent, specifically in the Congo. And I think that every time I think about the Congo, I think about Patrice Lumumba, unfortunately, who was assassinated and was one of the only leaders in that country to be able to was staunchly anti-imperialist and was working towards the liberation of the continent as a whole. But he was one of the youngest leaders on the continent, and he was assassinated. So I think that's one of the most resource-rich states on the continent. Countries, sorry, and until now has not been able to flourish or even receive any level of compensation for the work that they do at all, in one of the most highest concentrations of exploitation. So yeah, I think that I'm curious hearing now. There's a lot of Congolese organizers out there now that I think would be really great to because they are doing a lot of work to raise awareness on a lot of what's happening in the country.
I saw this opinion piece the other day on the Washington Post, which was pushing for sanctions on Eritrea, and so here's the title of it. It says, "Opinion: U.S. sanctions against Eritrea are overdue but incomplete." But I mean, there's been study after study showing how the sanctions affect the civilians more than they affect like the leaders that are in charge, and people die from these sanctions. I mean, the economic and policy research has released study after study showing how the sanctions on Venezuela, the sanctions on Cuba, it kills the people there, the working class people. So I wanted to know what your thoughts are on that, and if you could give us some background on Eritrea, since I know you're a descendant of that region.
Yeah, this is a really old story. I mean, since Eritrea had gained its liberation in the early 90s, it has been combating this same type of propaganda and attacks since day one. I mean, literally since we had gotten our independence. So I think a lot of what the problem is, again, which is actually why we preface the importance of HOA PALs, is recognizing that the people that are pushing this type of propaganda, or at least validating it, are also members of the diaspora, unfortunately, because there is a lot of internal issues in regards to how they believe the country should be organized, what the government is or isn't doing. But there's a level of recognizing that we must center African problems, must have solutions. There's no other way to go about it. I think that is probably one of my favorite slogans, because what that tells you is that having the US in any type of way affiliated with any type of solution strategy making on the continent, in Eritrea as a whole, is, I mean, it's complete BS. And they have been known to work with members of the diaspora, folks that are right around my age, in order to spew this same rhetoric, saying that we need to, quote unquote, hold the Eritrean government accountable. And my question to that always is like, one, how do sanctions hold government officials accountable? And two, how can we, as members of the diaspora across the world, in the States, how can we ever have the authority or agency to hold anyone accountable across the world, right? And I say we as members of the diaspora, but also like the place that we live in, this colonial capitalist imperialist project that we live in, can't bother to do that because it has created all of these problems. And so we see that, I don't even have to get into it. I think the sanctions, again, there's been so many reports showing that it affects the people more than it affects anyone else, in terms of the economic side of it and access to basic resources. I mean, cutting off trade is really big. And I know, I mean, I have family back home, and I often think about how for the past 20 or so years, simple things that they could not have access to, I've always recognized was as a result of the sanctions. I mean, we're a country that, since it gained their independence, we had nothing. I mean, we're the only country that has literally said no to AFRICOM and allowing any type of US presence in that way, militarily, and any type of economic control. So because of that, we have had so many drawbacks and pushback from folks outside of the country, but also in the States. So I think that there's a level, again, the reason, and I'm always going to go back to this, like why we need to ramp up political education in the States, because folks are thinking that accountability can be linked and connected to the US, to NATO, to the UN. And I think that we need to break that cycle of thinking. That's the biggest problem. Why sanctions don't fix anything. They destroy literally everyone and everything. So yeah, I would say that that's probably key. I'm gonna keep going back to that.
And it's literally an act of war.
Right.
I was just gonna say, like, one way that our country tries to keep us ignorant and tries to stray people off the path of reaching this political awakening of what's actually going on, is when there are leaders, like young leaders that are really smart, have a lot of potential. They try to there's something that you've called, that I heard you talk about on Black Power Media, called the influencer industrial complex. And you mentioned how you were getting invited to dinners where higher ups at the university you were at and organizations you worked with were meeting with their donors. And you brought up an example of Amanda Gorman, who is an example of somebody who fell victim of the influencer industrial complex. So what exactly is that? And how dangerous is this?
Yeah, so the best way to explain it is kind of basically starting at COINTELPRO. So when we had that period of time, right, when the Black Panthers were active, when we had young revolutionaries, people that were organizing, there was clear agitation happening in the country, right? That happened. And as of course, a response to it by the government was to assassinate everyone, strip everyone of anything, of any type of agency in order to organize and all that kind of stuff. So then there was kind of this new dawn of like CIA propaganda, like propaganda and indoctrination that was like, maybe instead of like assassinating everyone, we don't have to do all that work. We can just tell like the next generation and make them feel as though they are a part of this bureaucratic class, and make them, without any of the benefits, we'll only give it to a few of them. We're going to make them feel like they're a part of that class so that they can police their own people. And that is what the influencer industrial complex does. This specifically happens to young people. They bait young people from as early as like 13, 14 to believe that if you want to change the world, you have to be a part of these certain agencies, these certain spaces. So a lot of them, for example, actually bring up, this is really relevant. I don't know if you saw earlier in the news, there's this new like activist competition show where they were like, I think it was like Priyanka Chopra, somebody, I think Julianne Hough, and like another really problematic celebrity is like coming together to say, hey, if you are an activist, come to our show, pitch how you're going to save the world, and we'll give you money to do it. It's really weird, but this is where we're at. Like, they're literally using this type of stuff in order to bait people, to get them to be like, wow, I am an organizer, I'm an activist, and as so long as I work with X and X people, such and such agencies and organizations, NAACP is one. I mean, there are so many.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I don't need to get into that. But in my experiences, I have worked with so many of these groups, and there was a point in time where I truly believed that what I was doing was like saving the world. I mean, it was ridiculous. So what they do with these specific people, they choose a group of people, and they give them a little bit of a couple of benefits in order to change that maybe their personal conditions. And then at that point, they become indoctrinated in a part of this little, this class that feels as though they have the benefits of the capitalist class, but they in truth have absolutely nothing. But their job, again, is to police the people around them and their own communities, and to make them feel like being on social media is going to change the world, to quite literally make them feel as though a revolution is not going to happen in our lifetime, quite literally. So that is probably one of the biggest threats, at least within the young, like our younger generations and young people, especially with the rise of social media. This is kind of that new phase, I would say, of COINTELPRO. This is the new phase of the State Department interfering in any type of revolutionary work, because they're quite literally saying that we're going to create a class of people to stop you from learning the truth, essentially.
Yeah, using us against us. It doesn't surprise me that there's a competition now about like, like who's the better activist. Yes. And it wouldn't surprise me if it was like corporately sponsored, right? And it's being held by the people we're supposed to be fighting against. It's insane.
Exactly. But people, but it's literally like that. Folks won't understand it. I mean, it's like we have certain activists out here that are saying, oh, let's abolish the police, haha, sponsored by Wells Fargo or something like that. It's like, is this not an oxymoron? Like, so that's probably, again, one of the biggest threats we're facing today is this level of complacency that we are suffering from.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen it, with the Black Lives Matter, how that, has now become corporately sponsored. Not the principle though, but the movement, part of the movement. And with the Women's March especially, like once your movement is corporately sponsored and it's done, like it's over.
It's over.
How are you fighting the people you're supposed to be fighting against if they're representing you? It makes absolutely no sense.
Exactly.
So yeah, you are doing amazing work. I really appreciate the work that you do. Do you want to leave the people with any final message? Is there anything you want to let everybody know?
Yeah, I think I want to let everyone that is a part of, there's a colonized person in the States, oppressed person in the States, that we must embrace internationalism. That has to be a part of our class analysis in order to find what you believe is the liberatory framework for people across the world. We have to embrace the fact that folks in the global south, in the third world, that are suffering at the hands of imperialism, we must connect with them and organize with them in order to be able to kind of seek the liberation that we deserve. So I think that's probably the biggest thing I'd like to leave everyone with.
Okay, and where can people find you?
You can find me at on Twitter at Gual, Gual _ Raerey _ and then please check out HOA Pals. We're doing some really great work and continuing to ramp up on political education, specifically within the Horn. So if you're interested, follow us on Twitter at HOA _ Pals, PALS.
All right, Yolian Oglu, thank you again for coming on the show and informing us, about, what Pan-Africanism and, what's going on in the African region, some of the history. Your work is very much appreciated, and, we stand in solidarity with you. And everybody else, stay informed. Take care, everybody.